So I'd love to go into how this project came your way, and inspiration behind it, because obviously I know it's based on a true story.
Mhm.
It's, obviously the material is very heavy, and I'd love to know like that kind of that project origin story for you.
Sure. So, I mean, I naturally love suspense thrillers, and I was working on developing a story based on the serial shootings in Phoenix in 2005, 2006. And I was having dinner with a partner of mine from Siesta Key, and um, we he said, "Oh, if you like serial killer stories, you ought to, talk to my wife." And she unpacked this story growing up in Brooksville, Florida, in the 70s that was, it was something I immediately connected to, having, had similar experiences as a latchkey kid,
Mm.
of being, followed by random vehicles and things at times, and just not knowing what outcome that could be, but just sort of this lurking feeling. So I kind of connected to the story, and we met for coffee several times, and I just found this building block of a POV from the victim, from the survivor, that was different from any other serial killer story that I had really, seen previous, or the standard, which is really following a detective or a journalist, sort of tracking down a killer and trying to find out who they are, or um, the MO of a serial killer. But this was truly from the POV of a victim. And Sharon, Cobb, and I, when we wrote the script, wanted to pay homage to that and really place the POV firmly with the victim's story, so that if she didn't know who or what the serial killer looked like, then the audience shouldn't either. And that was sort of our kind of our guiding through line in telling the story.
That's crazy. I was going to ask, that was my next question. It's like, obviously it feels like it's obviously intentional that you don't ever see the serial killer's face. And now I know why with the POV, and it's so interesting. And so you said so different. It just focuses on the surviving victim and her story and her tale. And I love that.
Well, there's another piece to it too, which is basically, in doing all of our research, we found that, you know, we found that the father was also a pretty horrible, had done a lot of horrible things against children, and
Mm.
had been arrested in Michigan for it, had come to Florida and settled down in Weeki Wachee with his five sons, daughter, and wife, and had continued, and ended up having 40 cases of sexual battery against him, lead him
Mm.
to a 30-year prison sentence, of which he only did 10 years. All five sons have, big rap sheets. And, Billy and his brother were both arrested in California together for the murder of Renee Saling. But Gary turned state's evidence against his brother, Billy. So Billy ends up going to prison, but Gary was sort of let off and able to kind of continue his life back in Florida. He was just arrested 2 years ago at 67, 65 for narcotics charges at the Weeki Wachee property. So um, that was another component to it, was we're not entirely sure. We know that Billy was responsible and incarcerated for these crimes, but we're not entirely sure of who else may or may not have been involved. And these are ongoing cold cases. So there's that.
Wow. I know I got my 1 minute notice. And so my last question, I guess, is kind of a fresh one off of hearing you talk about it. Your knowledge and the research you've done. I mean, obviously doing double duty as a writer, you had to, but is amazing. How hard was that to whittle down with all the side stories and create the piece you did? Because it really is very driven and focused, and it's great. I really enjoyed it. In my head, I'm trying to think of my ADD nature. How did you whittle it down to keep all these details out?
No, I know what you mean, Michael. I think just going back to, for us, we were telling her story. We weren't telling the serial killer story. So we sort of left all of the serial killer backstory to another time,
Mm.
another project, perhaps, maybe a sequel. Um, and it really wasn't until after we finished filming that I finally got the call back from the cold case detectives, and they asked if I wanted to meet. So I did, and when we met, they sort of unpacked, the developments and having found I being able to identify one of the victims 45 years later through forensic anthropology and the great work of Dr. Kimberly down in South Florida. So that was neat, and it was also sort of opened up a door for me that is now leading into a docuseries that I'm developing. So,
That's awesome.
but a whole other side of things that I hope leads to really finding and identifying victims and finding closure for their families. Because at the end of the day, that is, I think that's probably the most important thing that could kind of come out of all of this is somehow those families find closure.
That's great.